In the early days of fan conventions, getting there wasn't easy. One fan crossed the country by clinging to the underside of a train. Others barely made it at all. But they kept coming. Because something was happening at these conventions. Something people couldn't find anywhere else. Forey Ackerman said that there were heroic efforts made to get to the Worldcons in those days. Dave Kyle and Dick Wilson traveled with other fans from New York in an automobile that had 30 flat tires en route. But the all-time fabulous hair-raising accomplishment was that of Olan F. Wiggins, editor of the Science Fiction Fan, who rode the rails all the way from Denver. And that isn't the half of it. Olan had expected he would be able to lie flat on some supporting beam under the train, but found instead he had to cling to some upper support the entire trip to Chicago. In other words, if he had fallen asleep or relaxed his grip, he would have fallen to the ground and been killed. Worldcon 2, aka Chicon, was seemingly a bit smaller than the first, only 128 people having registered with this convention throughout its run, down from 150 at Nikon. Although again, admission was free, so that number is dubious at best. While Chicon may have been a hair smaller, its organizers did two things of note. Number one, they had Doc Smith, the father of the space opera genre, as their guest of honor, which was a big deal at the time, since this guy was nothing short of a superstar in science fiction circles. Secondly, Milt Rothman and Jack Spear helped put on the first of many Worldcon masquerades, which was essentially a costume party and costume contest all rolled into one. Would you want to take a wild guess as to who won it? Our old pal Dave Kyle. Hi Dave, I hope those 30 flat tires en route were worth it. 30 flat tires suck, sure, but you know what else sucks? Riding 30 hours underneath boxcars to get to a convention. Hats off to Olan Wiggins and Lou Martin, a pair of Sci-Fi fan club organizers from Denver who did just that. Hopefully they won't have to travel too far for Worldcon 3. Worldcon 3 was hosted in Denver. Chicon, which established the tradition of selecting the next year's Worldcon at Worldcon, heard bids from several cities, but ultimately Olan won out, hosting what would be known as Denvention in July of 1941, which would only have an attendance of around 100, making it the smallest Worldcon yet. However, these guys also did a great job with their guest of honor, Robert Heinlein. Funnily enough, the convention organizing Denvention awarded what they termed as a difficulty prize for the fan who had overcome the greatest difficulties in order to attend the convention. A fan named Alan Class from Ohio won, as he had hitchhiked all the way to Denver. However, when the time came to award Class with his prize, a tidy sum of $25, around $550 or 420 pounds in 2026, the organizers found that they didn't actually have the $25 to give. Heinlein, ever gracious, donated $25 to Class. Talk about a class act. The Worldcon committee at Denvention elected to host the next Worldcon in Los Angeles. However, due to unforeseen circumstances, that wouldn't occur until 1946. It seems like there was a pretty notable gap in conventions until 46, with the only noted instances of fan meetups not really clearing the bar for conventions between 42 and 45. But we're here to talk about conventions, not meetups. Conventions. Nothing notable has ever happened at a meetup. At a fan meetup in Cadillac, Michigan in 1947, a fan by the name of Ray Nelson, a high school sophomore, invented what would eventually become a symbol for fandom in general, the Propeller Beanie. His account of its creation is as follows. After the discussions in magazine trading, we decided to end the festivities with a session of taking joke photographs, depicting the cliches of current science fiction magazine covers. We quickly improvised most of the props we needed by raiding the kitchen, but found at last that we lacked one thing: a suitable headgear for the fearless spaceman who was to play a starring role in the snaps. I leaped upon my bicycle and zoomed down to the nearest hardware store, where I bought some strips of plastic, a length of stiff wire, some beads, and a propeller for a flying model airplane. Arriving home, I whipped out my trusty staple gun and stapled these items together in a terrible hurry. He goes on to say that when the photo session was over, George Young took the beanie back with him to Detroit. Whether or not he stole it depends on your definition of theft. Suffice it to say that nobody made any great efforts to get it back, since nobody had the faintest notion the thing had any value. He continues, George began wearing it to meetings of the Detroit Science Fantasy League, and I, as a partisan of a rival club called the Wolverine Insurgents, began drawing fanzine cartoons of him with the beanie on. He wore it to small local cons, and then to the Worldcon in Toronto in 1948. Other fans began to make similar headgear out of anything that could be stapled, glued, or otherwise glued to the human head. It became clear that the beanie was no longer a symbol of George Young as an individual, but of any fan who possessed George's naive enthusiasm and energy. Any fan who might be reasonably expected to greet the latest issue of Planet Stories with a cry of, "Gosh, wow, boy, oh boy." Worldcon in Toronto, predictably Torcon and Worldcon number 6 at this point, earned its name, as it became the first truly international fan convention. No other convention series had crossed international borders until this time. In addition to hosting the convention debut of the Propeller beanie, thanks George, Torcon was the first Worldcon to host a fan guest of honor, Bob Tucker of Bloomington, Illinois. Fancyclopedia.org says that Bob was arguably the most influential figure in the history of fandom, active for nearly 8 decades. Active doesn't even begin to describe the depth of Bob's fan life. Tucker began writing for fanzines in the early 1930s, during the era of typewriters and mimeograph, the device which preceded the photocopier, and wrote all the way until his death in 2006, when his publications went out over the internet. It would take too long to go over every fan I've introduced you to thus far, but the typical fan lifespan of his peers went something like this. You'd get really into the genre of sci-fi as a kid, sometime in your teens, and jump headfirst into fandom, and be deeply involved until your mid-20s or so, where you'd gradually step out of fandom and into other interests. Even the ones who didn't fully leave fandom would participate in a somewhat diminished role, with the exception of a few folks like Moroho, Forey Ackerman, and of course, Bob Tucker. It seemed like Bob was all in from the start. He published his own sci-fi fanzines, starting in 1932, then went on to be one of the con runners of Chicon, Worldcon 2, in 1940. Though he moved into the space of being a professional writer, he still continued to be a fan, and was a regular attendee at conventions, even into the 2000s. Arnie Katz, longtime fanzine publisher, wrote of Tucker that, quote, "Tucker was a fan who became a pro, who never stopped being an outstanding fan. He was proud of his fiction, but he was proud of being a fan too. He understood that professional writing and editing, whether in or out of the science fiction and fantasy field, is a career choice, not an ascension to a higher plane of existence. He hated the artificial separation between fans and pros, and the elevation of the latter to star status that increasingly typifies the convention era. Fans and pros should mix informally and on equal footing, he felt. Though he often appeared as a speaker and panelist on convention programs, Tucker actively opposed events that segregated the pros from the fans. We will be seeing Bob later, but for now, we head back across the Atlantic to London, where the first iteration of what would later come to be known as Eastercon would be held, in the upper room of the White Horse Pub in May of 1948, with around 60 attendees, making it the largest convention in the UK to this point. The term Eastercon is significantly less concrete than the 2 running conventions we've talked about up until this point, Philcon and Worldcon. In order to qualify as an Eastercon, a convention would simply have to be recognized as an Eastercon by the English fans, and would surprisingly typically be held over the course of the Easter weekend. Nevertheless, after a point, there was a similar system in place to Worldcon, wherein the attendees would arrive at a consensus as to which con for the next year would serve as the Eastercon. Despite not having a permanent organizing entity, Eastercons serve as the national science fiction convention for the UK, and have continued on a regular annual basis since. It is worth noting that despite being agreed upon as being the first Eastercon, this event we're talking about, later nicknamed by some as WitCon, didn't happen on Easter, but rather happened a few weeks later on the holiday of Whitsun, known to some as Pentecost. Still, despite the venue being at a pub, WitCon had a con publication, schedule of events, an auction, and even a guest of honor, author A. Bertram Chandler, who would go on to be the Worldcon guest of honor in 1982. Given all that, even though the convention checklist established in Part 1 hasn't fully been fulfilled, I think it's fair to say that WitCon truly did serve as the first post-war British convention. Over the next few years, a couple more sci-fi conventions cropped up in the US and Europe, with Philcon, Worldcon, and Eastercon all continuing on a more or less annual basis, with the latter 2 continuing to grow in size year on year up until the 50s. In fact, the 1951 edition of Eastercon, the main sessions held in a hotel now rather than a pub, was known as Festivention due to its coinciding with the Festival of Britain, and would mark a high point of international fandom up to this point. From its inception, this convention was conceived as a truly international convention. So much so that nearly 4 decades later, British Fandom actually decided to exclude it as counting as an Eastercon entirely, due to the fact that its scope was more international in scale rather than national. The guests of honor were Americans Forey and Windane Ackerman, and Australian Lyle Crane. And among the 200 or so attendees were guests from Canada, Northern Ireland, regular Ireland, France, the Netherlands, and Sweden, along with the landlord of the White Horse Pub, who wasn't a fan per se, but had made enough fan friends in the preceding years to attend anyways. Festivention spanned across 4 days and was similar in form to what had been seen before: lectures, auctions, meet and greets, fan plays, and film showings, and cost 17s6. What the hell is 17s6? Let me look it up. 17 shillings and 6 pence, which comes out to just under £1 and would be the equivalent of about 36 pounds or $46 in 2026. Fanzine publisher Ted Carnell gave a speech wherein he announced that the next edition of his fanzine, New Worlds, would feature a, quote, beautiful unclad maiden on the cover. This threw the room into a state of shock, with Arthur C. Clarke standing up and making a brief counter speech that argued that trying to make sci-fi, quote, sexy was a commercialist sellout and morally bankrupt, and that the science fiction community should stop trying to cater to those desires. This, in turn, caused the dealers and professional publishers to give a counter speech, wherein they said that sex sells, and that provocative covers translated to higher sales, and without them, science fiction would never truly get anywhere. It's good that this argument was settled then and there, and that fandoms of today no longer have to argue over what is and is not the right amount of sexualization in their respective mediums. Anyways, moving forward into the 60s, we continue to see all the sci-fi cons we've looked at continue to grow and standardize. A couple more sci-fi cons crop up here and there. In 1957, Worldcon came to London in what they creatively named Luncon, fun. We started to have a growing contingent of fans attending these conventions who were fans of other forms of media beyond sci-fi. Things like comic books, but those folks were generally looked down upon by the rest of fandom. Fan historian Jack Spear wrote in his Fancyclopedia that, quote, sci-fi comics are all you should be interested in. Seems like splitting hairs, Jack, especially when Dave Kyle was publishing stuff like this and no one gave him crap. Still, by 1947, there were dedicated comic fanzines. Longtime fandom mainstay Jimmy Tarassi actually published one in 1952, but the fan conventions of the day remained explicitly dedicated to sci-fi literature. Maybe these guys should do their own thing. Before we get to that, it seems like there's something happening in California. Let's check on that real quick. Returning viewers from Part 1 might remember the Futurians, some of whom were avowed communists, others alleged communists who caused a stink at the first Worldcon. By the 60s, sentiments hadn't really grown any warmer towards communists, and the US was in the grips of the Red Scare and McCarthyism. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC for short, had turned its eye on Laurel Canyon in the Hollywood Hills. In 1960, Phyllis Patterson, a former public school history teacher, had refused to sign a political loyalty oath, and was therefore disallowed from continuing to work at public schools, instead finding work at the local Wonderland Youth Center, running a theater program where she organized an event in the style of Commedia dell'arte, which is a Renaissance-era theatrical form with a heavy emphasis on pageantry. While working at Wonderland, Phyllis met Robert and Doris Carnes, who served on its board of directors. In 1961, Doris was identified on a list of communists or communist sympathizers, published by the HUAC, which caused an uproar in the local community, especially among parents of the children at the youth center. Sadly, this was not a unique occurrence for the time, and many creatives in the area found themselves blacklisted by their inclusion in such lists, unable to find regular, stable work in their particular fields. While this might have been incredibly unfortunate for these individuals, it did lay the groundwork for Phyllis's dreams of repeating her theater event again, but on a larger scale. Many creatives who would otherwise have been gainfully employed at the time had found themselves without work and able to contribute their time and efforts towards Phyllis's project. She began asking around for volunteers to help her realize her vision, enlisting her husband Ron as manager of PR, graphic design, and business affairs, as well as having him create artwork to promote the event. She also brought on the blacklisted Doris Carnes as the fair's designer of costumes, props, and scenery, while another blacklisted individual, Oliver Haskell, offered to let the group utilize his 5-acre ranch in North Hollywood as a space for the event. Phyllis then approached listener-supporter local radio station KPFK with the offer to run the event as a fundraiser for the station in exchange for publicity, which KPFK eagerly accepted. Phyllis went on KPFK and appealed to its listeners to come out and help volunteer Preston Hibbard put the fair together. Hibbard's son recounts that, quote, Phyllis went on the air and asked everybody to come out and help my dad and bring whatever they had. The whole fair was built with scrap lumber and bent nails. He goes on to describe how his dad got a bunch of velvet fabric for free from local schools, which were replacing their theater curtains, and how the entire venue was put together with scrap for a total of around $150, or $1,600, 1,200 pounds in 2026, and was designed to look as much like an Elizabethan fair from the 16th century as possible. Phyllis wasn't done though. She wanted the fair to have an authentic feel from a social standpoint as well. So she brought on skilled improv actors to volunteer at the event, coaching them to speak in Elizabethan vernacular and street cries. She even brought on local craftsmen to put together props and accessories for the event, all while carousing the local artsy circles in an attempt to drum up attendance. And on the morning of Saturday, May 11th, 1963, the first Renaissance Pleasure Fair had finally begun. If you've been to a Renaissance fair in your lifetime, this first iteration would actually be pretty recognizable. People showed up in Renaissance outfits, often fashioned from bed sheets and curtains. Improv actors bantered with attendees in the streets. Entertainment like juggling and flame eating was on display, as well as lute playing and renditions of Shakespeare. There were bright fabric booths, which Smithsonian Magazine writer Jillian Bagwell describes as having sold, quote, handmade pottery, leather goods, jewelry, tapestry, woodcuts, etchings, prints, stained glass, wooden toys, and love potions. No word on the effectiveness of the last. Moreover, the organizers would set up on-site inns where visitors could select from chicken, spiced meats, salads, sweets, pork pies, ice creams, cider, and even mead. The KPFK crew broadcasted from the fair, urging its listeners to attend and interviewing participants and patrons on site, live on the air, in on-the-street style interviews. All in all, the one-day event wound up raising $6,000 for KPFK, or around $64,000, 48,000 pounds in 2026. While this was initially intended as a one-off event, Phyllis was asked what the plan was for the next year, and decided on the spot that in 1964, they'd make it a 2-weekend event, which they did, spawning not only an annual Renaissance Fair event, which continues until this day, but also inspiring similar events to start up around the globe. Smithsonian's Jillian Bagwell, whose article on the event I highly recommend, highlighted just how influential this first Ren Fair would be, arguing that its open air and DIY nature influenced events to come, such as Coachella and Burning Man. Attendee Alicia Bay noted that, quote, the fair was the first gathering of alternative types that I knew of in Los Angeles, and it had an intellectual focus on the history of an era of awakening from the Dark Ages in Europe, as we were awakening from the Dark Ages of McCarthyism. Now, just to quickly address this point, I fully comprehend that the Renaissance Pleasure Fairs weren't fan conventions in the nature of the science fiction conventions we've covered thus far. Totally aware of that. I understand that Ren Fairs, especially of this time, were more catered to the general public, like the Vril-Ya Bazaar and Fête from Part 1 was. However, Ren Fairs included several elements which would come to be prominent in future fan conventions, such as cosplay, themed events, music, food, and crafts, and the concept of being in character. Maybe this first iteration of a Ren Fair doesn't really count as a fan convention, strictly speaking, but we see in it elements which it pioneered, which would be reflected in cons to come. Moreover, at Ren Fairs of today, you'd be hard-pressed to not find fans of fictional fantasy, such as Lord of the Rings, everywhere you look. I would argue that at some point, Ren Fairs did become fan conventions in their own right. Back in 1961, right around the time Doris Carnes was getting labeled a communist, a 14-year-old kid from Long Island named Bernie Bubness wrote in his new comic fanzine, Comic Heroes Revisited, quote, I always wondered why comic book readers didn't operate their so-called fandom on the order of science fiction fans. SF readers managed to get a group of people together each year who rent a hotel, invite pros and fans alike, get publicity, and do a hell of a lot of other things, which adds up to a tremendous gathering of fans each year. Thanks, Bernie. Good question. As far as I can find, Bernie was the first person to ask such a question. The second person to ask about hosting a comic-centric convention was Bernie Bubness again, who wrote to fanzine The Rocket Blast's editor, quote, why don't the few members we have now meet in a chosen spot once a year? Now I know it sounds impossible, but who knows, it might work. If we pick a convenient spot for the greater part of members to meet, it might work. The editor of the Rocket Blast and good guy from later on in this story, GB Love, responded a touch dubiously, noting that a trip from Miami to Atlanta for a week set him back $90, or around $950, 715 pounds in 2026, but conceded that whatever the members wanted to do was alright by him. Bernie, however, was beginning to get on the nerves of his fellow fans. In that same issue of Comic Heroes Revisited, where he asked about a comic fan convention, he wrote a hypothetical account of a future comic convention, where he name-dropped several of the most prominent fans of the day. In this hypothetical, a couple of fans were partying, yelling, or even passed out drunk. The editor of the largest comic zine at the time, and preeminent fan, one Dr. Jerry Bales, was presented with the honor of serving as the chairman of a hypothetical con. However, Bernie had to talk Dr. Bales out of a noose after Bales discovered that 500 of the fans had charged their rooms to his. Back in the real world, Dr. Bales sent word to Bernie never to use his name in that way again. Bernie, however, was undeterred and continued to write for his and others' zines, an effort which ultimately led to him calling Steve Ditko on the phone. For those of us who aren't huge comic book buffs, myself included, I would like to answer the "Who is Steve Ditko?" question. And to that end, the short answer is that he's the guy who co-created Spider-Man and Doctor Strange with Stan Lee, among several other characters, who were a big deal in comic fandom even back then. Some might reasonably expect Steve to have brushed Bernie off, and Bernie did describe Ditko as having been curt on the phone. However, he invited Bernie to drop by his studio to talk instead. This began what turned into a lifetime friendship between the two, with Bernie telling that he never made an appointment with Steve after the first visit, and would just drop by spontaneously. Bernie recalled a time when he was 15 that, quote, "After my father passed away in May 1963, the day after my father's funeral in Long Island, I was far from home. I was in New York City and spent the afternoon in Steve's studio. That day I sat on the floor next to Steve's drawing board with my back against the shelves and never said a word, except to tell him why I was there. I felt safe. Steve would draw and draw, just like every day. I think he also felt safe. He just drew, and I just sat on the floor. Nothing much to talk about. But Steve wasn't much of a talker anyways. An hour or two later, I left and went home. I still feel I owe him. He came to my aid when I was just a kid, standing alone at the edge of a cliff. I like him a lot, and I have always admired his independence and strong will." That same summer of 1963, other comic fans had begun their own discussions regarding the viability of a comic convention, or as Parley Holman termed it, a Comicon. Dr. Jerry Bales seconded this motion and nominated fellow superfan Bill Joe White as the chairman of the preparation committee. All of these discussions notably did not mention Bernie Bubness, who had brought up the idea more than a year prior, but who could blame them? This convention business was serious work, best to let the adults handle it. Dr. Bales, living in Detroit at the time, recognized that New York City was the center of gravity for the comic industry in 1963, and as such, appointed George Pacinda, the New York correspondent for his zine, The Comic Reader, as the head of a committee to host the first Comic-Con, ostensibly to be held in New York City, and, as they had announced, would coincide with the World's Fair in July of 1964, a full 25 years after Worldcon 1 did the same thing with Nikon. In that same summer of 1963, another 15-year-old fan by the name of Ron Fradkin, another one of Dr. Bale's New York correspondents, and his friend, Len Wein, eventual co-creator of Swamp Thing, Wolverine, and a handful of X-Men characters, were making friends with fellow Long Island resident Bernie Bubness. While Bernie was described as being sometimes overly enthusiastic, Ron in particular was noted as being a gifted conversationalist. And as a correspondent for The Comic Reader, he was in somewhat regular contact with local industry professionals such as Jack Kirby, known for Fantastic Four, Thor, Captain America, and Black Panther, Stan Lee, Flo Steinberg, and Steve Ditko, along with several other artists and editors. Oftentimes, Ron would visit these people in their homes, where he noted they would be especially candid, since they didn't have their bosses looking over their shoulders. These interviews, while valuable to fandom from an information standpoint, also placed Ron in a particularly strong position when it came to networking with the pros. In September, news arrived in the American zines that Italian and French fans were planning an international comic convention in 1964, which put pressure on the committee headed by George Pacinda, which had failed to make any real progress in organizing an American con up to this point. American fandom as a whole was let down by Pacinda's performance, with even his patron, Dr. Jerry Bales, informing an incredulous readership of The Comic Reader that, quote, There is no report from the New York group planning a Comicon in 1964, as well as publishing several negative reader letters regarding the con's lack of materialization in that month's issue. By December of 1963, Ron Fradkin and Len Wein had both wound up on the Comicon committee, put together by Dr. Bales. However, Bernie had decided not to get involved, saying, "Taking my marching orders from a guy halfway across the country just did not sit well with me." Still, Ron Fradkin, who by this point was Bernie's best friend, convinced Bernie to attend one of George Pacinda's committee meetings at Penn Station. However, to his dismay, most of the committee's time together was spent sitting around, trading and reading comics. Fradkin would later reflect that Pacinda had wholly neglected to delegate tasks or assign responsibilities to committee members. Later correspondences would have Dr. Bales threatening to replace Pacinda, while fanzine publisher Ron Foss wrote that, quote, "Though Comicdom may be an infant group as compared to Sci-Fi-dom, they seem to have little trouble in organizing an annual con via the mails, and would appear we could learn something from them, at least as regards getting things set up." For better or worse, Dr. Bales or George Pacinda wouldn't get much of a say after this point. After the committee meeting at Penn Station, Bernie, Ron, and Len all walked to a bookstore together, and on the way, they talked about the convention. Between the three, they decided that firstly, the convention needed a new planning committee. Next, they agreed that the current committee's plan to have a 2-day event and a convention hotel was too ambitious, and that they should shoot for a 1-day event out of a meeting hall. And lastly, they decided that they should be the ones to organize said event, cutting out Pacinda and Bales entirely. The new committee wasted no time putting out a report in January of 1964 that their group had put down a deposit on a YMCA hall in Newark, New Jersey, for July of 1964. Unfortunately, since this group had formed from a schism with Dr. Bales' group, the trio would find a degree of difficulty in getting the word out that a convention was happening at all. In the months leading up to the convention, the only fanzine editor outside of the committee to seriously promote the con at all was Bernie's longtime friend, G.B. Love of the Rockets Blasts. In turn, the trio of Bubness, Fradkin, and Wein took to finding local fans' addresses and mailing them informationals and invitations directly. By April of 1964, Bubness had put out the update that 25 fans of the 200 contacted had accepted the invites, and dropped the bombshell news that Len Wein had been accused of stealing comics and was no longer on the planning committee. These allegations ultimately led to nothing, but at the time, it was a major blow to the con's credibility. On the upside, the European convention was slated for Easter of 1964, and when Easter came and went without news of a convention, the Americans were reasonably assured that they wouldn't be beaten to the punch by the Europeans after all. May rolled around and Wein predictably put out an opinion in his zine that Bubness was a communist, a charge that Bernie replied to with the statement, quote, "The only extremist group I belong to now is the Bela Lugosi fan club." Bernie and Ron, meanwhile, corresponded directly with up to 250 fans in an attempt to drum up attendance for what would certainly be the world's first comic convention. What's this? Oh, a zine. Dateline Comicdom. Who wrote this article? Dr. Bales? Let's see. I am informed that fantasy/film/comic fans in Detroit have scheduled a 1-day convention on May 24th, Sunday, noon to 6 p.m. in the Tuller Hotel in downtown Detroit. I have been asked to be one of the 3 guest speakers and have consented. When I say this came out of nowhere, I mean this came out of nowhere. I can't find any documentation of this being planned or organized until Dr. Jerry Bales' article right here. Most sources on the annual convention that this event birthed, the Detroit Triple Fanfare, don't even mention this one. But Bales did, in Dateline Comicdom number 9, dated April 1964, and a recap in the Comic Reader number 26, in June of 1964 for good measure. Maybe this event doesn't count as a con. Let's look at the details. Held in a hotel, that's a proper venue. Dealers are there selling comics and sci-fi books. Talks are given by Dr. Bales and some guy named Shel Dorf. There are door prizes, themes, sci-fi, classic film, and comic fans are all recognized. I think I'm gonna be sick. This counts. Jay Ballman wrote a book on this stuff. Let's see what he has to say. He's my source more than anyone else in this section anyways. It was not a comic convention. It was, as Jerry Bales said, for triple fans. Fans of fantasy, fans of film, and fans of comic books. If this could be considered a comic convention, so could a flea market, since comic collectors and comic dealers meet at flea markets as well. A comic convention is just that, a convention organized purely for appreciation of comic books and other things comic related. As much as I enjoyed his book, and I highly suggest you check it out. I don't think I agree here. I think Bales found a way to beat Bernie and Ron to the punch here. Back in New York, it was June already, and the now duo of Bubness and Fradkin, while having a deposit placed on the Newark YMCA, still hadn't finalized the date in July when their convention would happen. As he was mulling this over, Ron Fradkin went to interview DC illustrator Gil Kane. The topic of the convention arose, and Gil strongly opposed the convention being held in Newark, urging for Fradkin to reconsider and consider moving the convention to Manhattan. Ron recounted that he pointed out that most of the streets are numbered, so no one should have a problem getting lost, and that he argued that having the convention in Manhattan would make it easier to convince professionals to attend. Shortly after this, a college junior named Ethan Roberts from Queens called Bernie, having gotten his number from a fanzine and curious to discuss the state of the convention. Bernie complained about Ron wanting to move the convention to Manhattan, and Ethan, at this point speaking to Bernie for the very first time, offered to get a meeting hall free of charge in Manhattan for Bernie, since his parents belonged to said hall. Bernie agreed then and there to relocate the con to the Workmen's Circle building in Union Square in Manhattan, sight unseen. And thankfully, Ethan was good to his word, securing the site for the 1964 New York Comicon on Monday, July 27th, 1964. The challenge then became updating the 250 or so fans the duo had been in contact with to that point. With it already being June, and the con being in July, it was too late for them to print and ship another round of fanzines. So Bernie painstakingly wrote to each fan who had registered or expressed interest in attending the convention, letting them know of the change of venue, and paying for the stamps and stationery by selling some of his own comic collection. July came, and Bernie began a mad dash of trying to get professionals to attend. Ron got Gil Kane to send Tom Gill, illustrator of the Lone Ranger comics, and Stan Lee from Marvel sent his intern, Dave Twett, about whom not much is known. At DC, they begged editor Julius Schwartz to attend, but he refused, telling them they were too old to read comics. As Bubness was on the way out the door, Schwartz opened his desk and threw a small booklet at Bernie. What else would it have been but the 1939 official souvenir journal of the World Science Fiction Convention, Nikon 1. This was a real convention, Schwartz said as he threw the booklet. Bernie replied, "I don't care what you did 100 years ago." This caused the enraged Schwartz to literally throw Bernie out of his office and into prolific Superman illustrator Kurt Swan. Swan, having known Bernie from his frequent visits to their office, consoled him and walked him to the elevator. Bernie took the opportunity to ask him if he wanted to contribute art to the convention booklet, to which Swan obliged. Now he only had one target, his longtime confidant, Spider-Man illustrator and co-creator, Steve Ditko. In the years to come in the burgeoning comic convention scene, Ditko was notoriously reclusive. It would become readily apparent that the man did not like public attention and would actively avoid it. When Bernie dropped by in July to invite him, Ditko said, "We'll see," explaining that he had a pending deadline that might prevent him from attending, and elaborating that even if he did attend, he would do no speaking, at least publicly. Bernie exploded on him, begging him to attend. But he ultimately left without knowing Ditko's intentions one way or another. Bernie returned home, feeling defeated and overwhelmed by these proceedings. And who could blame him? He had all but promised Ditko in several correspondences, assuming he would be a shoo-in. As he was sulking at home early in July, there was a knock at his door. Another college student, this time a fellow fan by the name of Art Tripp, showed up offering to help, having been mailed by Dr. Jerry Bales, who had written to him saying that Bubness might need some help. Bernie recalls that, quote, "Art Tripp just appeared at my doorstep. He was older than the rest of us, but he was intent, serious, and built like a fire hydrant with muzzles. You could not ignore him, and he had a vision." This vision, it turned out, was to have convention souvenirs made up. Using his own money, Art collaborated with Bernie and a button maker to have buttons made up for the con, which read, Comicon 1964. While it was a seemingly small contribution, Bubness underscores that Art's appearance and his sudden assistance gave him a sorely needed confidence boost heading into the weekend of the convention. In the days immediately preceding the con, Art Tripp continued to make himself as helpful as possible, visiting both DC and Marvel Comics and persuading them both to donate art for the convention attendees. And both companies did, providing enough prints for every attendee to be given a complimentary piece from either company. Additionally, He picked up the buttons and phoned Bernie, Ron, and Ethan to confirm and finalize their plans, ensuring that everyone was on the same page. Finally, the day of the con arrived, Monday, July 27th, 1964. Fellow Long Island fanzine editor Rick Bierman took advantage of his trip to Manhattan to swing by the DC offices, where he spent some time interviewing and chatting up the comic professionals, who he recalls as always treating fans incredibly well, and securing even more art for the convention himself. When he brought up the fact that he was going to the convention, he recalled that, quote, "The interesting thing is the staff were aware that we were on our way to the very first Comic-Con, located a mere 15 minutes or 20 minutes away from DC's editorial offices. Not one DC staff member who gave us so freely of their time, energy, and work product had any interest or desire in attending the historic event. We had asked them to come, but they assumed it would be a room full of kids merely trading comic books." Bernie and Ron woke up that morning and made their way to Manhattan as well, but instead of heading to Workman's Circle Meeting Hall, they also stopped by DC to get more art for the convention, and somehow DC had art to give. Unfortunately, this detour cost the duo time, and even though the convention was scheduled to kick off at 1 p.m., they didn't arrive until after 1:30. Luckily, Ethan Roberts and Art Tripp had both arrived shortly after noon to inspect the convention space, both of them helping the handful of comic dealers who had arrived to carry their boxes into the hall and set up their tables. When 1 p.m. rolled around, some other fans began to arrive and were confused and anxious due to Chairman Bernie's conspicuous absence and the apparent lack of organization. The first of these fans to arrive, if you would believe his account, was a young George R.R. Martin of Game of Thrones fame. Thankfully, Art hopped into action. As he tells it, quote, "There were a bunch of kids there running around, and one of the meeting hall reps, who acted like he was in charge, stopped me on the stairs and asked, 'What adult is in charge here? Are there any adults here?' I showed him my driver's license and college identification and my ROTC card. And apparently that was good enough for him, because he left us alone. After I helped the dealers get situated, I set up a table near the front door ready for the 100 buttons, the pile of photostat prints from Marvel, and the stack of original art from DC. I also brought a brand new Aurora Superman model kit to give away as a door prize. The models had not yet been released for sale. As people entered, I gave each person a button and a photostat. The original art and the model would be given away later near the end of the show. After Bernie and Ron arrived near 2 p.m., Art and Ethan walked to 14th Street to direct incoming comic fans towards the venue and to hand out buttons and accept the $1.50 attendance fees. When Bernie arrived, he recalls introducing himself to the fans already gathered in the hall, including Stan Lee's intern Dave, who had in turn invited fabulous Flo Steinberg, who had yet to reach the peak of her fame as Stan Lee's representative. Bubness later stated that, "This must be heaven, I thought. I'm meeting people who only existed as postmarks on envelopes." It was no wonder that he felt that way. Almost everyone he met was someone who was on the mailing list of the Rockets Blast, the fanzine published by his friend GB Love, and the only zine to have truly promoted the con. After his quick introductions, Bernie began the convention's proceedings by giving a short introductory speech to the 60 or so attendees, where he described himself as a deer in the headlights. He then apologized for his tardiness and invited Dave Twett, Stan Lee's intern, to speak to what Bubness described as info-starved fans. Bernie observed that, quote, "He did not disappoint. Dave proved to be quite well versed on what Marvel was doing, and also what the competition was up to." As a side note, Dave Twett falls out of the historical record here. After July 27, 1964, nothing I can find mentions Twett, which is a bit remarkable, because by all accounts, he was a fantastic speaker at Comic-Con. As the first pro speaker at a comic fan convention, Dave dutifully fielded an hour's worth of questions and spoke at great length about his internship at Marvel. At one point, the air conditioning in the building went out, but no one member of the enraptured audience complained. Bernie acted proactively, and with the help of Art Tripp, he filled cups of soda provided by one of the dealers and began passing them out to the audience. Dave detailed how, as a college student, he had no interest in comic books until one of his schoolmates convinced him to read them. Then, having a sufficiently piqued interest, he took his internship position at Marvel, doing clerical work. He further went on to explain that Stan Lee would have been there, but was enjoying a vacation on order of publisher Martin Goodman. Dave explained that Stan Lee's last vacation was his lunch hour several weeks prior. At one point, as Twett dutifully answered question after question, a hush fell over the room. Taking a seat in the rear of the hall, the fans noted, was none other than famed Spider-Man author Steve Ditko. It seemed that whatever deadline he had looming could wait. As the clock approached 3 p.m., Bernie was forced to call Dave's session to a close in order to allow other speakers to take the podium. Though by many accounts, Dave remained swarmed by fans during the duration of the convention. But he ensured to respond to each and every one of them with great thought and candidness. Bernie described his feelings during this first intermission. I was the happiest kid in New York City at that moment. For months, all I worried about was why. Why take on this challenge? Why think I was even capable? 20 people? 30 people? 40 people? I didn't even know how many turned up, but I saw more than just me, Ron, Art, and Ethan. The damn luckiest idiot in NYC with the best pals in the world, Ron, Art, and Ethan. During this intermission, however, another fan showed up, the only fan explicitly banned from the convention, former planning committee member Len Wein, who would later state that nothing was going to stop me from seeing what my efforts had wrought. In an echo of the first Worldcon, Wein had shown up with a stack of one-page handouts of his version of the events regarding his alleged theft, and distributed them to anyone who was receptive. Bernie, upset at Len's violation of his ban, confronted Wein and began to argue. However, Art Tripp, friend to both, escorted the pair outside and calmed them down, at which point Bernie consented to allow Len to stay. To his credit, Len caused no incidents whatsoever during the con, and the two would eventually make up, becoming friends again and publicly declaring the feud null and void. Though Ditko had said he would refuse to take the floor and speak to the crowd, Ethan Roberts, the fan on whose auspices the convention hall was provided, did manage to speak with him one-on-one. He observed that he looked just like how he drew himself. Tall, thin, balding, dour, with glasses. I had a one-on-one conversation with him. Over the next 52 years of attending conventions, it ranks as one of the most depressing exchanges I have ever had with a comic pro. Ditko proceeded to tell me how hard the job was. He also said it paid too little and had few lasting rewards. It was a real downer. I think we had the same effect on Steve Ditko, because he never came to a convention again. To Ditko's end, years later, he wrote, quote, "Questioned by some comic book fans, I was continually asked questions about things which I could never have any kind of knowledge. Information, policies of comic companies, people I never met, arbitrary, scattershot, off the top of the head questions by those wanting some emotional gratification. Harsh words from a guy who, by his actions, showed himself to be reasonably kind and compassionate. People are complicated, I guess." The intermissions between speakers proved to be just as entertaining for the fans as the speaker sessions were, as fans eagerly traded comics between one another and patronized the 8 comic dealers who had showed up. Art Tripp, determined to be the responsible adult at the convention, did not participate in the comic swapping, but rather kept an eye on the dealers' boxes. In his words, making sure nothing disappeared. While the promise of commingling and meeting their pen pals proved alluring to the fans, the dealers found themselves perhaps the most blown away by the event, including early price list compiler and dealer Howard Rogovsky, known by some as Howard Ripovsky. Fan Larry Ivy reported that a number of $50 transactions took place as soon as trading began. $50 at this time equaling about $525 or 390 Great British Pounds in 2026. This event was to set a precedent amongst dealers that conventions were especially lucrative events, ensuring that they would be staples of conventions to come, and eventually actually have to pay for table space, providing dependable revenue streams for future comic conventions. As the day proceeded, Tom Gill, artist for the Lone Ranger comic series, took the stage and set up an easel, sketching on large sheets of paper as he spoke, and answering questions in a format which would later come to be known as Chalk Talks, which would become comic convention mainstays in the future. Fans noted his easy demeanor and jovial attitude. At one point, he would sketch a young fan in the audience, declaring he knew what the young man was thinking about. Drawing a thought bubble next to the caricature, he filled said thought bubble with a drawing of a sexy woman. The crowd responded with uproarious laughter. Fan Steve Kiesman spoke on the contrast between Gill and Ditko. Quote, "Ditko seemed just the way he drew himself in the comics. Very withdrawn and reclusive. He seemed uncomfortable. Tom Gill was different, very talkative, and very generous with the fans. That isn't to say that Ditko wasn't generous. He volunteered his time, his art, and his thoughts to the convention, and was cordial with everyone who approached him for conversation or autographs. He was just an extreme introvert. For him to have been there at all was an enormous concession." After Tom Gill left, another intermission and trading session began, before Bernie called the room to order again, this time to draw door prizes. Just to make sure everyone's on the same page, door prizes are typically a small number of prizes which are given at random to event attendees, usually drawn at random from attendance receipts. Since this convention was relatively small, and they had hit Marvel and DC numerous times for donations, plus the generous Dr. Jerry Bales provided $3.50 to go towards door prizes, the convention organizers could assure that everyone in attendance would receive at least one prize, with Ethan Roberts recalling that almost everyone received original comic book art. Curiously, Ditko recalled in 2015, 3 years before his own death, that the fans had taken these original drawings and thrown them into the air over their heads, in what he considered a childish and vulgar display of fun. None of the fan accounts from immediately afterward to the present day corroborate this story, but Ditko cited it as one of the reasons he never cared to attend a convention again. While the distribution of door prizes was the last scheduled event, the attendees and dealers remained in the hall, determined to get everything out of the convention that they could. And it was good that they did, because late in the afternoon, who should appear but Marvel fan liaison and secretary to Stan Lee, Flo Steinberg. She recounted that, quote, it was like 100 degrees and ice from the sodas was melting all over the place. She continued that, quote, this was a new phenomenon, the fan convention, so I went to hold up the Marvel flag. It was a nice bunch of people. It was a very pleasant few hours with chit-chatting. These last few hours passed, and the fans slowly trickled out of the workmen's circle, the last core contingent of Bernie, Ron, Ethan, and Art all leaving with a handful of others to go to a comic shop nearby. Art had to leave early to go to his girlfriend's birthday party, which was at 5 p.m. He didn't get there until 5:45. Ron and Bernie weren't long behind him, having to catch a train at 6:15. When they got back to Long Island, they found Len waiting for them. You guys pulled it off, he said. In the days after the convention, Bernie still had to go about printing the Comicon program booklet to send out to all the attendees who had placed an order for one. By this time, while the feedback was largely positive, Bernie had received an article for publication in the con booklet by fellow zine editor Rick Weingroff, who made a number of critical points about the convention and its organization. Disappointed by this, Bernie had resolved not to chair another convention ever again, and perhaps because of this, there was not a regular comic fan convention which would occur in New York City until 2006. We'll let Bernie tell the story from here. When I visited Steve Ditko after the con, I had to thank him for coming and for staying as long as he did. I knew he did not enjoy the experience, but I knew I had needed his help. I also knew I could have done better. I was depressed by the time I reached his office. I didn't plan to unload my feelings on him because I really wanted to just thank him. A few minutes into thanking him, I started telling him how depressed I was about everything. I didn't even want to produce that con booklet. Well, Steve had a way of just staring at you when he did not agree. A stare that you could actually feel. You would know when you disappointed him, and pray he would not look up from his drawing table to give you that stare. Well, I must have tripped the fail-safe button in him this time. He got angry with me and scolded my behavior. Quote, do not give up. You tell people you are going to do something, then do it. Don't make excuses. Whatever you did, you did. Get on with your life. End quote. I never forgot the lesson I learned that day. I repeated it to myself hundreds of times over the years. No one has influenced my life more than Steve Ditko, and I'm lucky I met him. Steve went on to contribute art for the convention booklet, art which he provided with a 1-week turnaround time, and Bernie went off and printed 120 copies of them, dutifully sending them out to the droves of fans who had ordered them. The front cover adorned with a full-page Ditko Spider-Man. And if you want to have fun, look up the prices on a 1964 Comic-Con convention booklet. I did earlier today, and I think the cheapest one went for something like $150,000 on eBay. Just ridiculous. In Bernie Bubness's story, we see the great potential offered in the community of fandom. Jay Ballman notes in the book, The 1964 New York Comic-Con, that, quote, becoming friends with Ron and Len was a social breakthrough for Bernie, a turning point in his maturity. Up until that point, he lived a solitary life as a collector, as he says, never sharing the hobby with any other neighborhood children. At some point in my childhood, I found it more comforting to hide in my room, safe from my increasingly abusive father and a very confused mother. Ballman goes on to explain that Bernie considered his fellow fanzine contributors to be an extended family, and that, quote, having friends who lived close by and with whom he could meet in person and socialize with face to face, and who shared his interest was life-changing to say the least. He continues that before meeting Ron and Len, Bernie was just like the superheroes he had read about, living a double life with a secret identity. Bernie affirmed this and said, I never mentioned comic books at school. As I was evolving into a juvenile delinquent, I never mentioned comic books to my tough guy pals. We would get drunk on wine and beer in my room, leaning on cabinets filled with comics, but we never opened them up. Ballman finishes his reflection by saying of Bubness that, at long last, Bernie's years of reaching out into fandom had finally paid off, with a positive new group of friends who set him on a better path than the one offered by his school friends. He could finally be himself, a comic book reader, a science fiction fan, and an artist. His social life from that point forward would not center around juvenile delinquency and antisocial acts, but instead, it would focus on an ever-growing range of fan activities with Ron and Len that would eventually culminate in the world's first comic convention.